don't just build an automation to pat yourself on the back and say, my firm's great, right? It's like focus on the systematized automations. Automations really become valuable for firms when you can have like common logic or common use cases, right? This is important to build standardization because one thing I'm like passionate about with all of this is not just the technology, but like, why are we doing automation?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest episode of Strategy and the Virtual Controller, where we talk about all things client accounting services, cloud accounting, app tech stacks, workflow, and we throw in a couple of stories of things we've done along the way. Some have worked out, some have not worked out, but ultimately it's about sharing the insights that Penny, Breslin, people that we've met along the way can share and can learn from as well. So my name's Damien, Greathead. My co-host is Penny Breslin, and Penny, wonderful to see you today. And you've invited a special guest along. Who have we got?
We've got Korey Cournoyer. And there's a reason I wanted Korey to be on this. Years ago, I went into a small meeting in San Diego and saw two fantastic women called Heather Satterley and Liz Scott talk about ZEPs. And I'm sitting in the back of the room going, thank God, yes, yay. They are fantastic. And going on, they've done Appy Camp and they have the Appy Hour, and they were the queen of integrating with Zaps and Make, another product that does connectivity between apps. And they, to this day, they're just brilliant. And I love them. And then I was at Bridging the Gap, which I don't know if we discussed that, but it was a fantastic conference. And Chad Davis was giving a session on using ChatGPT to help you write code so you can drop it and embed it into your apps for integration. And Korey was in the room too, and I saw him. Everybody in the room was geeking out, like going, oh my God, this is so cool. This is so cool. And I'm sitting back going, how many firms can really afford to have a full-time integrator? I mean, we used to have technology, used to have an IT department. Now you have to have an integration department if you're going to be effective. And not everybody has that capability to have somebody who does nothing but make sure that the integrations on all your apps internally are working and externally towards your clients are working, and that anything that's new and interesting. And, you can log on to some accountants' websites and they have a chat bot that comes up, and, it's like this stuff is not always applicable to everybody. And if you go down the rabbit hole of saying, I'm going to be my own integrator, you're working in your business and not on your business. So Korey worked with Heather and Liz, and Seth Feinberg introduced me to him, and I'm going, oh, this is great. Now, Korey, tell Damien what you do for those people out there that can't have that integrator in their own.
Yeah, I'll kind of give a little bit, maybe also some of the context of kind of like the journey I think will be helpful. Coming out of GrowthLab Financial, been with GrowthLab for about 9 years. But long story short, it's like we're always kind of building these apps and experimenting internally. And like we always knew there was like a use for automation, right? Even if like years ago before it kind of became a trendy thing it is today. But nothing systematized, right? Nothing like formalized. We're just kind of like, yeah, maybe we can do a Zap for this thing, right? And we mess up all the time. And so fast forward when we acquired Heather's firm, she was doing a lot of these Zaps and kind of like consulting on this. And obviously, as you said, Penny, like promoting it, right? And Heather convinced us, I look back and it was like crazy at the time, but she's like, you need a full stack developer. I'm like, what do you mean we need a developer, right? It's like, this is crazy. And we took the plunge and we hired a developer. And so we kind of are approaching this from a different lens, right? We know we need automation across the firm, but how do we do this? Like, what does this actually look like? What does this mean? What do we automate, right? Like, that's a big thing. Everyone wants automation, but then they come to the, like, that crossroads of like, okay, well, now what are we going to automate? And we ended up hiring a developer and spinning out STRMS as it is today, where we work with primarily accounting firms or companies in the accounting industry, where we help them not just develop apps or integrations, but we actually help them identify what automations are actually going to be valuable or impactful to their workflows, right? we approach this from a workflow and process perspective before a technology and integration perspective. Because if you have a crappy process, an integration is not going to solve that crappy process, right? And so what we do is we turn this into a subscription model for firms where we spread the cost of development to make it actually affordable for firms to like develop something, right? I think what we've noticed is a lot of firms will go to development companies and they'll say, yeah, Penny, Damien, we'll develop this for you, but it's going to be $10,000. And then, oh yeah, it's going to break in 2 weeks. And so just come back to us, pay us more money and we'll fix it for you. Like it's a broken model. And so we turn this into a subscription model where we amortize the cost of development, but then we maintain it for them, right? Because workflows are supposed to evolve, right? As firms grow or focus on different directions, like workflows are meant to evolve. And if you have a static automation, like you're kind of stuck in the mud.
So Korey, could you provide the listeners and myself actually just a practical example of one of these integrations that you build sort of in the practical sense from an accounting firm's perspective? What are some of the things that you're working on?
If a firm comes to me and they're like, I want automation, but where do I start? The best place I usually recommend starting with is actually the client onboarding side of things. Because when I say client onboarding, I'm saying everything from you get a new lead in the door through to it gets handed off to that, your services team, whatever that looks like. I start there because that's where all of your apps integrate, right? It's like, that's where you're kind of standing up all these apps. That's where data is being double entry, triple entry between apps. So an example to your question, Damien, is like, a lead comes in the door, automatically add them to your CRM or, your workflow management system, however you're tracking that. Automate an email out to schedule a meeting. It could be setting up a Google Drive or Box folder specifically for that client, prepping up the engagement agreements based on a pricing calculator. Once they sign, set up the workflow, the piece of work or the template for the task list in the workflow management system, and then notify people. Like that's an easy example. Obviously, it's custom to the firm, but like onboarding is a key piece.
Damien, do you remember
And
when we did that? Do you remember when we did that workshop?
Yes.
And I asked those CPAs, what's your onboarding? And not one of them could do it.
Yeah, but it's an interesting point that what Korey was saying is all of these different systems that you've got to set up and duplicate and in triplicate and quadruplicate. And typically what happens is you fuck it up somewhere along the line. The numbers are imposed incorrectly or the date's entered incorrectly or something along the way. In one of those 3 or 4 times where you have to enter client information, that date is entered incorrectly and it has, and again, just by sheer mistake of a data entry error. But this, not only automation does it sort of streamline the processes, but it also sort of does that error proofing and making sure that those small errors which have a knock-on effect down the line aren't actually occurring, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think onboarding is such a critical piece of the client experience too, right? It's like the client has a bad onboarding experience. That kind of sets the tone a lot of times for the relationship with the firm. And so if you can like automate that more or make that experience with the client smoother, not only are you solving for the double data entry and the timeliness of the system setup, but you're helping that client experience too, which is invaluable in other ways.
You're also setting the tone. You're not dropping any steps. How many times does a contract come in and somebody forgets to do the email? So it doesn't get assigned to somebody. And I love the fact that he starts with, it's not the technology, it's the process first.
Yeah.
What's the process? The technology piece is a plugger, but if you don't have the process.
What's your background? Like, where did you come from and how did you get to this position? Like, are you an accountant by trade that sort of realized you, like me, wasn't a good accountant, or were you always in the coding side of things?
Neither. Funny. I actually, a long time ago, when I applied to college, I applied as a pre-dental. I thought I wanted to go into the medical field, right? Obviously night and day difference, right? But I was also interested in like personal finance, right? Stocks and it's like typical things. And I ended up meeting Dan Gertrudes, who's my business partner at GrowthLab, and joined him on this journey at GrowthLab. And I was kind of just helping him out with different pieces of technology. I was always interested in apps and kind of tech in general, but never from the coding perspective. And through the last 9-10 years with GrowthLab, I've kind of worn different hats around kind of the strategic side of things, the technology side, app stand-ups, kind of all over the board. So more directly to answer your question, like my experience has not been specifically on coding or specifically in the accounting field. It's mostly been just the strategic lens of it, which is why I'd like to focus more on process versus just solving with a line of code. Like that is our process, right? Before we tell a firm that we will work with them, what we actually start with is like, let's document your processes before we do anything, right? Like before I even tell you what to automate, like let's document your processes because like I said before, like crap in, crap out.
We had this conversation on our last episode, actually, where Penny is, you don't need to outsource until you've actually worked out your processes, until you've done that. So how much time do you spend on helping firms with their processes? Like, is that a big part of what you do? The actual coding part's probably the smaller, maybe not the smaller part of it, but on the front end, spending a lot of time really understanding process. And what's your take on, as Penny said, we ran a course, this was a good 10 years ago now, but ran a course and nobody knew what their onboarding process was. But what are firms' levels of process documentation and that you're seeing out there?
You ask a firm or someone at the firm to explain their process, and maybe 50% of the time they can, right? But they're kind of talking about it. Yeah, I get the lead and I do the call and then I send an engagement agreement and then the work starts, right? Like they can explain it to you, but when you start asking questions, like, oh, well, like, how does the work start? Like what apps? Like are you doing it? Is a salesperson doing it? Is an admin doing it? Kind of all the above, right? Like, so they can, like a lot of people can explain their process, but what I like to do is actually map it on like a visual like flow chart, including like what happens, who touches it, what's the trigger for it. Because when you can look at it on a visual, it's much easier to say that's my pain point, or like this is where things break down, right? You see the bigger picture. So before we even start development or anything, we'll spend a few hours with firms and like help them map and document and understand like what automations are going to be realistic. And I use that word intentionally because we don't want to automate everything. But if you have this like nuanced flow or nuanced automation desire that like has 35 different levels of logic for it and like super complex and nuances for every client, like it doesn't make sense to automate, right? It's like, I'll be the first one to tell you that. The automations really become valuable for firms when you can have like common logic or common use cases, right? It's the simple automations that actually make the most value, because when you have the complex ones, things are always going to be like going wrong, right? Like that's natural with technology. So really it's like designing that workflow, spending multiple hours up front with the firm to design that before we start any development work. Because by the time we won't get to development work, we shouldn't be starting development work if your workflows are still in flux, right? Because then we're just going back and forth.
And do you see that a lot? Do you see a lot of firms that say, here is my standard process, except for this client? Well, we do it a bit differently for that client. We do a bit differently for that client. We do a bit differently for that client. Yeah, but not that. Oh, actually, no. Now that you say that, we don't do it that way for that client. Or actually, Bob down in the hall, he does it a very different way. Like, how often do you actually? Because again, I think we all talk a good game on so many things, but when you get into it, there's always those yeah buts. So how standardized are these simple processes in the firms that you're working with?
They're not standardized. Let me tell you that. Let me start there.
Yeah.
They're not always standardized, which isn't a bad thing, right? It's like at least I'm glad we're having the conversation, right? To like help them get to that point. I don't think firms should be like disappointed in themselves or like beat themselves up over not having these things. But I think starting to recognize like this is important to build standardization, because one thing I'm like passionate about with all of this is not just the technology, but like, why are we doing automation? Right. It's like, and you ask 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different answers. Are you doing it because you want to make more money? Is it because you want to get your time back? Is you want a better work-life balance? Like, why do you want automations in the first place? And not everyone's answer is going to be the same. And so I think realizing that your processes aren't super defined is okay. But then coming back to the table with like, why do I want to automate them in the first place? Do I want to get my time back? Do I want to make more money? Like, I'm bottlenecked. My customers are leaving me. Like, what is that? What is the purpose of it? I think helps design what your future process looks like when we go through that process.
I see this all the time where somebody, if I recommend an app to somebody goes, well, it doesn't do this one thing and it doesn't do this one thing. Well, how often do you need this one thing? And it's like, so you're going to throw out this wonderful app because you have two Koreans that don't fit into it. One of the things I think when Korey was saying standardize, I think that when you can standardize, you can become flexible.
Mhm.
And that sounds like it's a dichotomy, but that's true. And right now, you're not flexible. You're just a squirrel,
Mhm.
right? But if you standardize and you get that plane of, okay, this is the way we roll. When something is out of the ordinary or atypical, you can make a decision clearly on whether or not that atypical point is of value to you. Based on the value that Korey just said, what is it that you want to do this? Why do you want to automate?
Mhm.
Do you want to automate just because that's what everybody's doing? Do you need to automate some things? Just like when I say to people, do you really need to outsource? Let's first see what you need. You don't even know what you need to outsource. Well, you don't even know what you need to automate if you don't have a standard process. Then how can you flex up to automation or out of automation or over to a new automation? Also, things are changing fast. Things are changing rapidly. I mean, when Chad was giving that discussion just a couple of weeks ago, ChatGPT had changed and so had Claude. And so it's like, and he goes, oh, I forgot there was an update. And then, those things happen. But that's his whole flipping function within that company. And you can either work in your business or you can work on your business. And if you're an owner partner, you want to be working on the business, not in the business. And I would love to geek out. I would have loved to fill with those codes and stuff, but I have to give that to somebody else. I have to give it up. Because if I do that, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do to grow the business. So I could see standardization as the first step to becoming flexible.
I think that makes complete sense. Yeah.
Like you, Korey, I didn't start off being an accountant or a coder or anything. I'm trained to teach U.S. history in high school. I mean, if now I'm talking about automation in the future. You have to know past before you can go to the future, but maybe that's why, but I don't know. But I just know that I've spoken to quite a few people, even just at Scaling New Heights, a client who has me consult with them. He's like saying, I have to work on my business, not in my business. And I asked him what he's doing. I said, you're not working on your business when you're doing that. You're working in your business. Go get somebody outside of you to take care of that so you can focus on something else. And as much as I think accountants inherently, they're very detailed orientated, and I can see eyes light up when Chad was doing all that coding and stuff. Not everybody has the time or the bandwidth in their firm to be able to do it and have somebody come in. But what really got me is, and I know Heather and Liz do this and they do a fantastic job, but things break.
Mhm.
And Korey has a system so that if it breaks, I'll take care of it.
Yeah. And that's also why we've designed it in a way where it's a subscription model. And that's why we don't jump to automate like development, because if we don't understand your processes in full and where the potential like errors are going to happen, like there's no alignment there, right? So I don't want to build something and amortize the cost of development only for you to turn around in 2 months and be like, yeah, this doesn't work for me. Like it's breaking every day. Like we want to create the clear alignment up front. I also think like there's so much, because over the past few years, there's been such a like wave of new technology in the accounting industry. that's exciting, right? Like that's huge. That's great. But on the flip side, like I think we're seeing like a lot of shiny object syndrome. And like you said, Penny, like people are saying, oh, this app's going to solve this one problem. But a lot of apps are not just like, we all know this, like they're not just plug and play, right? It's like it could solve that problem and it could do it really well, but you have to quantify like, what is it actually going to take to stand this up and manage this? And that's what often gets left behind.
Yeah. And who's going to manage it? Is it the person that has their work backed up on their desk? Is it you who is supposed to be the rainmaker, the person who brings in clients? You know, really, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, that your next hire isn't necessarily going to be a mini me of you. It's going to be something totally different that allows your accounting business to function in a new world.
What you're saying is really interesting, Penny, in terms of firm owners recognize this. And so Korey, what are the sorts of firms, what size of the firms do you actually work with? And what sort of organizational structure, or what sort of people do you need on the team to make this happen? I mean, going back to Penny's point that you can't be the partner, also Korey's primary contacts, the person that's running all of this. Like, what are the, I guess if you were to think about what are the best practices that you see in the firms that you work with, what are some of the things that either firms have changed or firms are already doing to make this type of a relationship successful? Because that sort of that ongoing as a service type model is quite different. But so what do they need to have in place or put in place to make sure they get the most value out of it, make sure that it works? Because I think it's a great idea. But yeah, back to Penny's point that if I'm also the partner, your primary contact, the bottle washer, the rainmaker, etc., does it all then just again, if I then got to do the process documentation, what are firms that are doing this well? What are they getting right?
So the average firm that we work with is roughly 5 to 50 employees is what we've seen as kind of like that sweet spots for value. What are they doing right? I think they're being transparent with automation. And what I mean by that is, there's also this interesting perception of like automation is going to take over everyone's job. And I think if you're not the partner, you're not the manager, or like you're a staff accountant or bookkeeper or whatever, controller, even, like you can kind of hear a lot of these things about automation and see that it's automating your work. And I see a lot of firms where some of the team members, as I talk to them, like they have hesitation, right? They don't see it, or maybe they're threatened by it, right? I'm personally not a believer that automation is going to replace employees tomorrow, right? Because I could also make the argument that if you have a really great team, like you're going to find other things for them to do. You're not just going to turn around and fire them, right? Like that doesn't make sense. And so I go back like full circle, like being transparent with your team around like, what is the purpose of automation? Like, why do we want to do this? What is this going to get back for you as a team member of this organization? It's not just so that you can make me more money. Maybe it is, but it's also like, what is the work-life balance? Like helping your team understand that we can help automate some of those things that you don't really enjoy, and you can actually enjoy your job more, right? That's I think a critical piece that I found is like firms that are successful in this, because if their team never adopts the process that needs to be in place for automation to work, then like we're back at square one.
Similar to what Korey is the same stuff that we have to do as outsourcers, is that if your team doesn't adopt this, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
If your team doesn't buy into using online integration of apps, they will not, when it breaks, they're not even going to let you know it broke. They're just going to tell you it doesn't work. It's like the CPA who said, hey, I heard that this GL cloud app you're talking about doesn't really do a good job. Where did you hear that from? Your billable hourly bookkeeper was afraid of losing her job?
Mm-hmm.
Well. Yeah. Okay. I mean, how did you explain how this was going to help her rather than hurt her? Did you consider that? Did you have the discussion? Were you transparent? Transparency is, I think, a kind of a new mindset for accounting, because it's inherently been a very cloistered, and I use that word because I was raised in the Catholic religion, so I understand about cloisters. And it was a very cloistered place. And I don't think that to be effective and grow, that you can afford to be cloistered. And so transparency. And it's similar to like where we said, like one of my clients, Rachel, takes her team aside for a solid week, takes them offline and out of work to go through this, to discuss what do we need to change? Where do we have misses? Where do we drop it? And you talk about like backed up work. How much time is being spent on chasing backed up work that could easily be solved with some automation? And instead, you're having human beings who you expect to have billable time. They're spending time on things that you don't consider of value enough to even look at. How could we fix this with a tool instead of a human? So that the human can get on with what's important.
There's some unquantifiable like values in automation too. Like, yes, we can focus on the perspective of it's going to automate these 5 tasks, right? Or these 10 tasks, whatever that is. But there's also the piece of like talking to your team and being transparent with them. Maybe your team will come back and say, you know what, like these, I have to do them a lot and they're tedious and I want to automate them. But there's this other process that happens twice a month and I just hate it. I hate coming into work to do that, right? Like if you can solve that pain point for a team member, like you're reducing your risk of turnover, of them finding another job. Like you're reducing like the employee burnout perspective of it. Like you can't quantify those just in an ROI measurement, right? It's the reduction of that risk profile, which is also like a massive piece of automation.
Yeah, it keeps you from losing good quality employees.
Yeah.
And years ago,
probably an interesting one. Yeah.
We had a marketing company for accounts. And that's how I kind of got started, because I did all of the back in the old day, desktop, CRM, create the triggers for the automation. That was my job. But because it was a marketing company we're talking late 80s, through the 90s and early 2000s, it was seasonal.
Yeah.
We didn't, that, Damien, somebody who worked in software marketing. So it was very seasonal. And so we had good, solid employees. And like Korey said, there were times when what they did during the busy season was extremely important, but what were they going to do in the non-busy season? Well, they were good employees. And I'll tell you what they did in the busy season was show us how much better they were and smarter than and there was always something, because they were so good, that we could find for them to do that made it of value to us to make sure that we kept the same team even through that slower season. Well, there is no slow season anymore. Now everybody's overburdened because it doesn't stop. And like to Korey's extent, who's dog and pony, sit down. Who likes this? Who doesn't like that? It used to be send it to the outsourcer. Maybe some of that should be going into automation first.
Mm-hmm.
And then see if you need to outsource, that's why I like Korey's, wanted to talk to Korey about it, because I should be the last option. I should. But realistically, I should. And I should be the last option because everything else is running smoothly and we still need more help.
Automation helps from a lot of perspectives that we talked about, obviously, but team growth, team retention, employee happiness, engagement levels, like the human aspect of this, especially in the world where less and less people are going into this industry, like finding new talent, younger talent is harder and harder every year. How can you leverage this to stay in the driver's seat?
Well, I also go back to Chad Davis, who you were chatting about at the start of the conversation. And their firm, Live CA out of Canada, it's what, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. They started with, I think, two of them, Josh and Chad, started together. But I know that before they even got to, say, 5 team members in total, one of them was the technologist. And then they very quickly developed the technology arm, not for necessarily development of apps. I think that came later and integrations and whatnot, but they had a team dedicated to the setup, the training, the rollout of the technology on the client side. So going back to, again, what you were saying about using technology, using automation to take those tasks off of the accounts team, off the tax team, off the bookkeeping team, and putting it onto dedicated people who probably like this stuff, who like understanding how the apps work, who like to see how that they can eliminate steps in the process and streamline process. And God forbid, actually like the interaction with clients and training clients on the technology. I think what you said there, Korey, was really interesting. That if you can take away 2 or 3 tasks through automation that a team member just loads doing every month or every 6 months or whatever it is, that's going to make that work environment infinitely better for everyone involved. And more often than not, there is someone on your team that loves the technology, that loves doing this and loves being that maybe that primary contact with someone like you, Korey, to figure out how to get automations really working in the firm. And I think that's a really interesting one. A lot of folks are probably thinking about, how does automation save me time and ultimately make me more profit? But actually, I really like that it probably streamlines your team members' lives, makes that easier for them. And I go back to Chad Davis and his firm, his accountants, his tax folks, they weren't answering the password questions. They weren't training the clients on how to use the technology. They had dedicated sort of experts and people that loved doing technology and training. That's what they were focused on. So I think that's a really interesting point, Korey, that I think is probably often overlooked. That if you look in your firm, you've got your routine mundane, but then you've probably got a couple of processes as well that, people loads doing.
Yeah. And the last piece I'll add to like one of the benefits, I mean, there's a million, right? But like it full circle here to the beginning of this conversation, it forces team members or organizations to have systemized processes in place. Like it forces that. And doing that allows you to understand where bottlenecks or breakdowns happen, right? Because if it's just one person doing the whole process, like it's kind of hard to back into like, where did something break down? Are they overworked? Does the process take too long, right? But if you know this automation always breaks or this automation never works, you can start to pinpoint like where processes break down, and it kind of helps you on that continuous journey of like process improvement, right? So there's a lot to it with people.
So we sort of started the conversation with onboarding as one of the easier places to start. So that if that's sort of one end of the spectrum of fairly easy, good places to start, what are some of those other areas that you're looking at automating in terms of the integrations between the technology, the app stack? What are some of those other processes that once you've got some of the basics in place that you're working on?
I'm going to answer it in maybe a slightly different approach. Starting with where people should not automate. You should not automate these one-off tasks that are nuanced for 100 different clients. You're not going to find value because automation technology breaks. We know that. If you're saving 5 minutes for one client per month, like it's not really worth the hassle of that, right? So these super complex, nuanced automations, don't just build an automation to pat yourself on the back and say, my firm's great, right? It's like focus on the systematized automations. So to your point, Damien, it's like the sales, the client onboarding process. It's the internal like reporting, right? It's like even just the extraction of data to automate reporting. How many of us are like pulling data out of our time systems, our workflow management systems, our billing systems, spending 5 hours a month, like manipulating that data to get reporting, right? Like those are also automations, right? It's like extracting data and reporting on it, in visual manners. It's things such as I've been really passionate lately on automations around um, pushing data in and out of like Slack or Microsoft Teams or like a communication channel. I think that's an interesting one that we've been focusing on a lot of because Slack or Teams, I'll use them interchangeably. Um, that's where your team lives every day, right? It's like they are usually in those systems every single minute of every day. If you can centralize automations around there, whether it's pushing data out of Slack into your workflow management, like a Carbon, or pushing data from there into your time tracking for PTO requests, like it doesn't just have to be an existing process. It could be streamlining tasks in a completely different process. Makes sense.
I see so many messages where I put that in Slack or I put that in Teams, but it's not in your workflow. You could push stuff out of the workflow to Slack or Teams, but pushing it back into it, yeah. Because so many times you're in there in the chat and you go, oh, I got to make a task for this. And you would love to be able to just go ahead and make that task.
Yeah. So it's not just like, it's not just existing processes, right? It's finding ways to ease the burden, ease the time of just things that people do on a daily, weekly basis that aren't processized.
And that's really interesting because I think of Slack. I read something when I sort of put a star on it to remind me an hour to come back and do something with it and all that. I never do. I don't know why I do it, but I still put a star there, remind me in 30 minutes. And and then the reminder pops up and I just ignore. But I was also thinking as well, it's like I think a lot of people think automation and they think about automating client processes and whatnot. But even there, Korey, you were sort of saying Slack conversations about PTO requests and all of the opportunities for automation within your own processes, within your own back office. I think that's another area where you can save a considerable amount of time and also I think can save a significant amount of mental burden, can't you, as a result of automating these routine tasks of running your own business, not just the client service aspect of it.
I mean, I don't think I've talked to one firm that the firm owner or manager would say, yeah, I wouldn't like some mental space back. I don't think anyone would say that they would not want some mental space back, right? It's like, you got Slack messages, you got emails, like maybe you're not acting on them, but they're still taking up mental space. And that, like, you can't quantify that, but that's everything.
Korey, this has been really interesting and I think a really interesting business model and service for accounting firms. Where do people find more information about you and your services?
On our website, STRMS, STRMS.io. And on LinkedIn, we post a ton of content around some of the automations that we're actively building so that people can get a sense of, like ideas and creativity there too.
And we'll make sure we add the links in the show notes and all that type of stuff. And I actually just jumped on the website as I was having a look there. It's sort of interestingly quite upfront, fixed pricing, but average firm costs $465 for it. But obviously that's an average and it depends on what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm sort of thinking $465 a month
versus another human.
Exactly. Versus sort of employee costs and whatnot. And if this frees up my team to let them do more of the good stuff that they do, I think that's quite economical. Again, that will go up and down depending on what it is that you're looking for. But I think when we started the conversation and I'm sort of thinking, oh, this is, $3,500 a month or something, but that seems very economical.
We want it to be something that's achievable for firms, like that they can actually implement. And yeah, we have firms that are paying a quarter of that. We also have firms paying double that, right? Like for the average firm that's going to solve multiple workflows and multiple pain points, we've had great success.
And actually, because is there an upfront sort of discovery cost, or is it typically, because actually that even, and Penny, this sort of puts you and I out of work a little bit, but that actually is quite economical in terms of that process mapping project, because whereas I know a lot of process consultants will charge, say, $5,000 a day, and they will then, and basically then you've got a lot of work that comes out of it, et cetera. But this actually sounds like a quite economic way of not only getting those processes documented with the longer term vision and long game of getting them automated through integration and whatnot. So I think that's also another interesting way to think about how you can fast track the process documentation and standardization of your firm. So just another economical way to do that, again, with that longer term vision of automating as much of it as possible.
And that's why we have to, that's why I'm very particular about, we want to do that process mapping up front, because since we amortize the development cost over the subscription period, if we build something that's not going to be valuable for you, you're going to turn around to me and say, this is not working, rebuild this instead, right?
Yeah.
Which, we make no money forever, right? If that was the case. So we have to create alignment up front.
And there's a lot of things that get processed in a business, and it's in developing first the initial process. Then you can say, okay, this is the technology side, and that's where Korey comes in. So it's almost like it's a Venn diagram.
Oh,
you know, this is a section of it that is particular to the technology. That's a whole new individual process within a process.
Mm-hmm.
I know it sounds weird, but
there's layers
frankly,
to it.
it's the only way you can live in a world of cloud apps. It's the only way you can do this. I know how many we handle. I know that I can see where the brakes on, and sometimes the brakes are in humans, but sometimes the brakes in the technology, and I could see it being wasted.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than wasting that technology time, we just did it. It took us 2 months of processing it out and flipped it over. I told you this last week, we were going to do this, and it started last night in India on their August 1st. And I got my report on my August 1st, and it worked perfect. And everybody was on board on day one. But the process had to be defined first, and then see how it was going to integrate and all the other apps it was going to touch and all of that. Sure. Oh my God. And day one, everything worked perfect. If I hadn't done that process first, it would have been foobarred.
I think my sort of final comment and takeaway from this is, again, going back to last week or the most recent episode, Penny, outsourcing is not necessarily the answer. Automation and app stacks aren't necessarily the answer. It's really around process and standardization. And once you've got that in place, then you go on to these next steps. And that's when I think you turbocharge your business, but you can't turbocharge until you got the grounding sort of sorted out in terms of your processes, your documentation, your standardization of what you do. I think that for me is the real takeaway of this conversation and the last episode's conversation as well. Perfect. Right. Well, I think that's a really good place to end today's episode. So Korey, people can find you at STRMS.io. And we will put the links to your LinkedIn profile and the company on the show notes as well. Penny, any final thoughts from you?
No, everybody just have an enjoyable summer. I'm looking forward to going offline and going up on that mountain and just being inaccessible for a couple of weeks. That would be really nice.
Couple of weeks. Fantastic. Korey, it was really great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Really interesting conversation, and look forward to hearing more about what you get up to over the coming months. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it on your LinkedIn profiles. If you've enjoyed what you're listening to, write us a review. And if you'd like to connect with Penny or myself, you can find us both on LinkedIn, Penny Breslin and Damien Greathead. But Korey and Penny, thank you very much for your time. Wonderful to see you as always, Penny. We'll see you next time.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Damien. Thank you,
everyone.
Korey. Bye-bye.